So it's my great pleasure to welcome back to Prout Chapel, Laura Maylene Walter. Laura is the author of 2 books, Living Arrangements, and her recent debut novel, Body of Stars. Her short fiction essays have appeared widely in journals such as the Kenyon Review, The Sun, Poets and Writers, and elsewhere, and has received honors, including an Ohio Arts Council Individual Excellence Award, the G.S. Chandra Prize for Short Fiction, and a National Gold IPPY Award given for books published on independent presses. In addition to her writing and publishing, Laura has been active in the literary community in Ohio in many ways. She helped found the literary journal Gordon Square Review in Cleveland and served as editor until 2022. At the Cleveland Public Library, she is the Ohio Center for the Book Fellow and created a book podcast, Page Count, which has an Ohio focus. I urge you all to follow the show. It's great. And she's been part of the Incubator, a free literary festival put on by Literary Cleveland. Now, part of being a writer, I think, is not just writing and putting words on paper, but also creating culture, making culture in the world. So it's partly individuals with a book, reading, but it's also making culture in the world, and Laura's activities in Cleveland have been exemplary of that. Her novel Body of Stars is somewhere on the line between a dystopian novel and a fabulist novel. The premise that women's futures are literally written on the body by a pattern of freckles, moles, and birthmarks allows the author to explore deeply questions about gender identity, toxic masculinity, and how our beings are inevitably entangled with our embodied existence. Its premise distances itself from our own world and thus allows fresh and insightful perspective on our troubled times. Please join me in welcoming Laura Walter.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lawrence. That was a wonderful introduction. And thanks for having me here at BG. It's really lovely to be back at Prout. I haven't stood up here since my second year reading. This is great. And I'm looking out and I'm being flooded with memories of Prout, and I'll share a quick one. I don't know if it's appropriate, but I'm going to share it, which is I remember being in here once at one point for a reading, and it was warm outside, so all the windows were open in here. And we were sitting here and someone walked by, and from the outside, they just saw a group of people gathered in a chapel and must have thought we were here to worship instead of having a creative writing or a reading, and decided it would be really funny to shout through the window, "I love Satan," or something of that sort. And there was this long pause because clearly they thought they were going to very much offend us. And there was this long pause, and I think we all just started laughing because of course, we were a bunch of heathen writers gathered to read. So on that note, I'm here to read for you. So thank you for having me. I am going to read from my novel, Body of Stars, but since I know a lot of you, if not most of you, are writers out there, I like to do something a little different when I read for a writing audience, which is instead of doing one long reading of reading a large chunk, I am reading multiple very short sections, just a page or two for each section in most cases. And I'm going to break it up by talking a bit about my process for writing this book, because it was a very long and complicated and sometimes arduous process full of rewrites and revision and trying to figure out a whole world. I invented a whole world with this book, and it was my first time doing that. So before I read the first opening pages, I'll take you back to the summer of 2012, over 10 years ago. I was at the Breadloaf Writing Conference, and I was taking just a one-time craft workshop while there. And we were reading Amy Bender's work. And if you know Amy Bender's weird stories, full of a lot of weird body imagery. And we were tasked with coming up with our own speculative premise involving the body in some way. And this was kind of a throwaway 20-minute long writing exercise. I had no hopes. I don't usually like doing writing exercises in class, but I decided to give it a go. And I looked down at my arm and the moles on my arm, and I just thought, you know, what if you could tell the future based on the moles on your body? and I started to write. And I had no idea that I was about to write something that would have a hold of me for almost 10 years before it was published. But I'm going to read the opening page or so of the book, which is actually shockingly fairly similar to what I wrote in that writing workshop. From the time of my birth, my brother Miles read me like a map, tracing my patterns of freckles and birthmarks to see my future and to learn something of his own. In those early years, my body was as much his as it was mine. To share meant letting him lift the back of my tank top or sweater so he could search my skin for a hint of what was to come. I never complained because I believed we were the same, that the predictions marked on my body were part of him too. We were partners working in a discipline that required practice. He'd approach me at the breakfast table or in the upstairs hallway and ask if he could examine me again, as if my markings might have shifted, a phenomenon we both knew wasn't possible, at least not yet. When I was too old for Miles to see me shirtless, he studied my arms, focusing on the constellation of moles near my left elbow. You're lucky, he told me. You know what will happen. It was true. I did, as a girl, have this blueprint of my life imprinted on my skin. At sleepovers, my friends and I stripped to our underwear to read our own futures. We lingered over our lower backs, the place for love and romance. You'll fall in love more than once, Marie told Cassandra, and Cassandra in turn studied Marie's back and said with wonder, you'll live with a woman, but none of us knew what that meant. All we knew was that our lives were speckled and advanced on our skin, as it had been for our mothers, as it was for our sisters, while our brothers and fathers were left in the dark. Over the years, Miles memorized me, every inch, and documented my marks in his notebook. That notebook was thick, with unlined pages and a pale blue cover. Sometimes I'd sneak into his room and flip through it, the little dots of ink pressed so hard into the pages they made a series of bumps, like a book for the blind. I was nearly 16, and the childhood markings my brother recorded would soon be outdated when I matured to my adult markings. Then I knew he'd want to study the revised map my body had produced. That summer and early autumn leading up to my 16th birthday was a time of uncertainty, of risk and wonder. All around me, other girls were entering puberty, and before long I joined them. My hips widened and I grew taller and gained weight. I understood these changes extended beyond my physical body. Soon everything would change. My predictions, my expectations, my future, my entire life. So some of that has been revised, but especially the first opening paragraphs were very similar to what I wrote at that writing workshop. And I didn't know yet what I was doing, but I knew a few things. I knew I was writing a novel in a world that was like ours, but different, and also a regressive world, a very patriarchal world, even more so than ours. I knew that women, or at least how women in this very gender binary world were described, women would have this power and not men. And I knew I had a sister and a brother. And so right there, they had tensions because one of them had this power and the other one didn't. And from there, I set myself on a journey of writing and revising and rewriting. I told some of the MFA students earlier today that I wrote a draft of this book before coming here to the MFA and took some time off during the MFA, worked on stories, and then returned to this and wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it some more. I signed with an agent about 2 years after I graduated from the MFA and kept working on it. And I had to learn how to do so much. This is my first time writing a speculative world, a whole, something that wasn't realistic in a book-length form. And I learned a lot of the challenges that come with that, such as, wanting to really immerse the reader in the world without explaining it, but you have to convey the world so that they're not confused. And it's a lot harder than it looks, is what I found. So some of the details I worked on were the setting and bringing certain parts of the world alive. And I'm going to read another fairly short section that shows some of the setting and part of town and some of the research I did for this very special part of town, which is a place where interpreters of the future of these markings on women's bodies, where the interpreters live and where they work. And for research for that, I went to Lilydale. Does anyone here know what Lilydale is? Yeah, I see some hands. It's a spiritualist community in Western New York. And even though Lilydale looks nothing like what is described in my novel, that is a place where so-called spiritual mediums live and work and take clients. And so I visited because I was inspired by that for my novel, what I call the Interpretation District. By a trick of fate, I was born exactly 2 years after Miles, giving us a shared birthday. Sometimes I imagined we were twins, that we were separated by neither time or space. We looked enough alike to make twinhood seem possible. Hair the same walnut color, hazel eyes shaded more brown than green, and even the same eyebrows and ear shape, as if I'd been stamped out as this copy 2 years too late. I was always chasing those 2 years, trying to catch up to my brother as if I could outsmart time itself. That year, summer flared into autumn abruptly, moving from heat to frost with little transition. The first cool day in September was a shock, the chill rendering the air unfamiliar. I remember it so clearly because that was the day Miles asked me to walk with him to interpretation class. His teacher, Julia, wanted to see me before I matured to my adult markings. I'd only met Julia once before, but I'd heard things about her, that she was skilled as an interpreter, though her methods were unorthodox, and I was curious what she had to say to me, a near stranger. Miles walked just ahead through our neighborhood, mapping the future tucked under his arm. I tried to keep up, but remained a step or two behind. My legs were long, but his were longer. We were the same, and we were not. He was worried about being late. I understood that without him having to say so. As the first and only male student in Julia's class, he needed to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. We'll make it, I assured him, but we'd only just left our street and had more than a mile to go. We lived in an older neighborhood situated on the edge of downtown, a community of sidewalks and hedgerows, but the homes were packed together and some showed their age. One of the houses neighboring ours dropped peels of paint like a great shedding birch, and another had plywood nailed against its upper windows. Only a few blocks away, the lawns grew green and lush, the houses bearing pillars and turrets, and in one case, a pair of lion statues flanking the walkway, their mouths cracked open in perpetual roars. We crossed into the downtown city limits, where a wrought iron arch reading future as fate marked the entrance to the interpretation district. Once we passed under it, we entered a maze of cobblestone streets lined with crooked rows of townhouses. The interpretation district was half serious, half farce. Both real and facetious interpretation took place there, with professionals like Julia coexisting alongside pseudo-interpreters who hung neon signs and distributed coupons on the street. The crystal balls, palm readings, tea leaves, tarot cards, dream interpretations, they were nothing but theater. Only the markings were true. As Miles and I made our way down the main streets, the contents of the storefront windows flashed in the corner of my eye. Lights, lace, crystals, the cheap rattle of beaded curtains. These were the trappings of fantasy. I found myself telling Miles about the girls I knew at school who patronized these businesses. They delighted in the outlandish predictions false interpreters dreamed up, improbable romance, financial windfalls, adventure. Some of them say they want to come here for readings after they pass to adult markings, I said. Miles shook his head. Don't waste your money. Besides, visiting the interpretation district as a changeling, it's dangerous. Only at night. Maybe, but it's still too much of a risk. He was referring to how newly changed girls, especially bold girls or reckless girls or vulnerable girls from damaged families, were more likely to disappear after dark in the interpretation district. These streets attracted scores of visitors and were thus a prime target for predatory men. I already knew this, we all did, but like most people, I preferred not to dwell on it. Back then, I viewed abductions as I did my own mortality. They were an indisputable fact of life, and yet too vast and horrific to hold in my mind for more than a few seconds. So I didn't. I was 15, a teenage girl simply spending the afternoon with her brother. Julia awaited us, as did the whole of our futures. All we had to do was keep moving. So as this world came together, and you could probably clearly hear parallels to our own world, where I feel like every day in the news I'm reading about some girl or woman missing or abducted or taken. And what I was doing in my book was heightening it to a different kind of level, even though it was things that we really do deal with in this world. But as I did this, I was, grappling with the premise of moles on your body predicting the future. And, I had to ask myself, well, how does that work? And I can tell you that I wrote an entire draft of this novel, and I did not know how it worked. Obviously, it can't work, it's not real, but even in my own mind, I didn't have a system in mind. I didn't have a rationalization. I didn't understand how it could work even in a fictional world. So over the years of revision, I set out to teach myself how it worked. I had one writing group member who early on suggested that there would be some kind of guidebook or Bible for the markings. And I took that idea and I started writing a whole guidebook for this world. I started drawing in my notebook of what the markings might look like so that I could actually picture them or describe them to people. I started inventing a system for how markings on where on your body or what the markings on an individual spot would look like. And so I was able to come to a sort of order for this fictional universe. And that ended up spilling out into the book even more than I expected. So I can show you a few things. If you get a copy of the book, you can see that there are some illustrations. I know you can't see it from where you're sitting, but this is a full body image of a woman with lines and categories on her body that details, where the markings are on the body, what they mean. And by the way, I actually found a version of that image in an oddity shop. It's from a really old medical textbook. It's recreated by my publisher, but it was inspired by a real medical textbook that would discuss all the feminine problems on a woman's body, like wandering uterus and all those kind of fun things. And then I did not expect, by the way, when I was making this, that they would end up in the book, but I have little diagrams that I was making, recreated by the publisher, but that I was just making on a free graphic image program. Again, never had any idea that it would one day appear in my published book, but these things, they helped me figure out what I was doing and how I was doing it. And so that helped me in that long process of figuring out this world. Okay, I'm going to read two separate short sections near each other in the book. This is to show how I was continuing to draw out some of the main tensions in the book, the main dangers for the girls and for the young women in this world, and also more of some of those rules of the markings, rules of how these actual moles that predict the future, how they work. When Deirdre disappeared, I felt the world should operate differently, but the days should be longer or shorter, the skies brighter or darker. I expected food to taste hotter, oxygen to pierce sharper in my lungs. If I pricked my finger, I believed the blood wouldn't stop. I thought everything would hurt more. I was wrong, but also right. The world kept turning, same as ever, night to day and back again, but I noticed a shift within my family. Miles began shadowing my every move. He insisted on walking me to and from school, and more than once I returned from my locker to find him watching from across the hall. Our father, too, grew more protective in the days following Deirdre's abduction. He ate breakfast with me before school each morning, a new routine for us. He showed up to the table freshly shaven, still adjusting his tie. Sometimes he wrenched it so furiously it looked like he was punishing himself. I worried he was coming undone. He was busy, I knew, preparing for the installation of the new banner advertisement at work, a project that consumed him. At the time, I was only aware that the ad was expensive and important to his career, and that it would hang on the bank building downtown. I knew it was coming, we all did, but that didn't mean I was prepared for the disruption it would cause. In hindsight, it's clear that timing was all wrong for the ad. If its debut had been delayed by a few weeks or months, things might have gone better for my father. But on the morning of the fourth day of Deirdre's disappearance, the banner went up as scheduled. It appeared quietly in the earliest light of day and waited for the city to take its notice. The ad showed a drawing of a naked woman. That was all I heard at first through the rumors already circulating at school. I couldn't imagine it, couldn't see how my father had a part in something so scandalous. I might have ignored the gossip had my brother not appeared to me at school that afternoon. He put a hand on my shoulder tightly, like he was trying to hold me in place. After school, he said, his voice low, we're going downtown to see it. And then he was gone, flowing like water through the crowded hall, the lingering pressure on my shoulder, the only sign he'd been there at all. We walked downtown that afternoon without saying much, without even looking at each other. We were on a mission. When we reached the bank building, Miles and I stood side by side for a long time, staring. So this was what our father had brought to life. The banner was a marvel and a catastrophe. It showed a woman drawn in black ink strokes on a white background, a body defined in lines soft as a new star at dusk. She was stylized, which meant she had no markings, the details glossed over. More than a pretty face, the banner read. It was an ad for skin cream. The jar could be spotted in the lower right corner, but even I understood that wasn't the point. Can't believe he really went through with it, Miles said at last. I looked at him. You knew about this? He didn't answer. I didn't tell him what I was thinking, which was that I couldn't understand how our father had created this or how he could have told Miles but not me, how people harbored secret parts of themselves. My brother and I just looked straight ahead, embarrassed by the woman's nakedness. But I was also drawn to her, maybe because she was so clearly a woman, not a girl, maybe because she seemed to have chosen this nakedness to revel in it, and I couldn't imagine growing up to become that confident myself. Or maybe I admired her simply because she had no markings, no future, no dark realities awaiting her, because she was free, because her body was her own. The day after the banner appeared, Cassandra and I sat next to each other in health class for our annual lesson on the passage to adult markings. This, too, was so familiar, it was embedded in our memories, but we were asked to endure it again regardless. You can never be too prepared for such a monumental change, our teacher said, and she started the film strip outlining how we change overnight as we slept. Our childhood markings would vanish and be replaced by more detailed, mature markings. It would be a painless process, nothing extraordinary. It was, droned the narrator's authoritative voice, perfectly natural. When the film strip ended, Mrs. Ellis lectured us on the high lucidity we faced during our changeling periods and how we could control the flood of new sensory awareness with breathing exercises. We practiced together as a class, breathing in and out, loud and slow, until a girl in the back row broke into laughter. Mrs. Ellis marched over to her. Do you think this is funny? She asked, meaning our bodies, our lives, our futures. The girl fell silent. Cassandra and I shared a glance. Outside of class, we didn't always take our bodies so seriously. We delighted in discussing the rare cases, like the boy someone once knew who started tattooing marking patterns on his body because he knew he was meant to be a girl. Likewise, we heard of girls who identified as boys and tried to scar their predictions out of existence. These were stories adults chose not to address, but privately we reveled in sharing them. They hinted at a broader, more complex world. Girls, Mrs. Ellis said, if you learn only one thing today, I hope it will be to respect yourselves. That day in class, Cassandra and I passed notes back and forth. We wrote to each other in bubble letters and folded slips of notebook paper into tighter and tighter squares until they felt thick, indestructible. But in reality, our notes were no more than paper, easily torn or crumpled. They were as fleeting as our girlhood, which I could feel ticking toward its conclusion. And Cassandra, I predicted, would pass to adulthood before me. I could see her impending change, could feel it approaching with every passing hour. That was Friday. By Sunday, when my mother woke me in the blue light of morning to tell me Cassandra had called, I knew I'd been right. I rose and followed my mother to the kitchen, where I pressed the receiver to my ear. Through the trick of the phone line, Cassandra still sounded like my friend, but something was different. She was changed. And a few things I want to comment on those sections is when I thought about this world, if this is the norm, if this is, your body predicts the future and it changes at one point around puberty, your predictions change at one point. And I thought, what would that really look like? I mean, this would be kind of a fact of life for my characters. And I thought too, back when I was in elementary school, and I'm sure we all have similar experiences of getting the film strip or the video or whatever it is about puberty and your changing bodies and all this stuff and what that was like, if they separated people. And I thought the girls and women in this book would have a similar process in school. So I was layering in these details that weren't always there in the first draft, but that I think became a big part of it. I also mentioned high lucidity, which will be in another excerpt coming up, which is when girls go through this transformation, they have this time of really heightened senses. And just to give you a little writer background on when I came up with that idea, my agent at the time when I was revising said, when these girls' experiences change, it feels like there should be something bigger that's different during this kind of magical time. Like basically, if you're taking puberty but blowing it up into something different in your novel, what would that be like? And she left it up to me to decide. And I was thinking about it, and this might sound terrible, but I had someone in my life at the time who unfortunately had an accident. He was running and hit by a bicyclist. He's fine, but it was very serious. He fell and hit his head. And he was telling me the story, and he said after, he was knocked down pretty hard and hit his head, and he jumped right up, and he was talking and tried to avoid going to the hospital. And he said, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. And thankfully he went to the hospital because he had a hematoma and he could have died if he didn't go to the hospital. He needed surgery, he needed help immediately. And he was telling me how that period, when sometimes if you hit your head like that, you think you're okay, and it's called like the lucid period. And so he was telling me this story, and I mean, writers, I know he was fine when he was telling me, so I knew he was okay by then. This was a while later, but you know how writers have this way of kind of taking things from life or just using it in a way as just almost like compost, that you break it down and think about how you can use it. And I thought about lucidity and high lucidity in my book, and I thought of just that time when maybe not everything's okay, but you think it's okay, and you feel really alive, like you feel like something is very heightened. And so I took that and used it for my book. Some of those excerpts also, or one of them mentioned Mapping the Future, which is the book I created within my book, which is a guidebook it's a combination of rules for living for girls and women. And again, this is a very patriarchal, regressive society. And the marking patterns that I have in the book are included in this. And I also have informative sections, lists of what girls should or shouldn't do, such as not wearing revealing clothing and not walking alone at night, some things that we are still actually told for real in this world. And I also have, to keep rounding out how the markings work and how they are interpreted and how they are read, I have some short written sections, and I'll read one right now. So this is from Mapping the Future, an interpretive guide to women and girls. Method for conducting a reading. Breathe, study yourself. Rely not purely on sight, but also on touch, on instinct. The task you are about to complete is both a gift and a responsibility. Respect it. Once the subject has disrobed, take her left hand in both of your own. Hold her wrist fast with one hand while your other skims the length of her arm. Study the diagrams in this book, but also allow yourself to move by instinct. Left shoulder, right shoulder, then cross over to the back of her neck. Lift your subject's hair and read her scalp. Move to her temples, her forehead, her cheekbones and collarbone. Cross now to her right arm and hand before moving down, breast, ribs, stomach, then upper back, lower back, hips, the legs and ankle and feet. Pay attention. A star is not a circle, is not an arc, is not a ring. A pale mole is not the same as a minor one. Remain open to professional assessment. Be willing to reveal yourself. To read and to be read is an act of trust. A true reading is an offering, a question, an act of surrender. And so we ask you to breathe again. Move your finger from the page to the skin. Touch, hold steady, tremble, release. So you can hear there's a bit of a different voice in the book. When I was writing in the voice of this guidebook, which is very old, I actually looked at Bibles and other religious texts to get kind of a feeling for the tone. And in my imagination, it was written by a committee of men about women's bodies. So the book does contain different voices like that in different kind of texts, which was, again, when I first wrote this book, the first draft, I didn't have any of this in there, none of it. It was just a really, really messy, bad first draft that I had to rewrite a bunch of times. And so I think my point there is, I know a lot of you are writers, a lot of you are working on novels or story collections or poems, and you won't always know where you're going when you start writing, I think, and you just have to kind of trust your messy imagination and just follow it. And then I just kept following this and kept refining it and kept adding to it and kept revising it. And if I hadn't continued to do that, I never would have had a published book. So we all know the persistence thing as writers, but it really is true. Okay, I'm going to read two more short sections. I talked about that kind of changeling period when, an analog to puberty, when girls get new markings and they have the high lucidity. So I'll read a scene when my character, Celeste, experiences that. I knew before I opened my eyes. A gentle tingling radiated through my limbs from a deep and secret source. It was subtle, like catching the glimmer of a faraway wind chime and wondering, after the sound faded away, whether it had been there at all. Closed on my body. I did not want to lift it away. I did not want to see what had changed. I lay there feeling my skin touching my pajamas, which touched the sheets, which touched the blankets, which touched the quilt. I could hear the beating of my heart. It was the day before my 16th birthday. Time was moving forward, the future shifting, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I pushed off the quilt and stood. Slowly, shivering with the cold of morning, I dropped out of my pajamas and my underwear. I avoided the full-length mirror since reflections could distort markings and looked down at the new future made manifest on my body. My skin flashed before me, a swerving wreck of predictions. I shut my eyes, disoriented, the morning sun swept brassy and strong through my eyelids. I could feel it, thermal energy, the hot center of the earth. I cracked open my right eye to see the sunlight shimmering between the slats of the closed blinds, a wavering vision of heat and salt and painful bright. So this was high lucidity. I sensed the blood moving through my veins, spreading outward like the branches of a tree. I could hear it too, along with the thrumming of my heart, the rustle of leaves outside, the wind coursing over grass. This was survival level hearing, the kind meant for wild animals, for the hunted and the primeval. And then came the smells, an egg frying downstairs, a wisp of old bleach in the bathroom, the spots of dried toothpaste on the medicine cabinet mirror. I bent forward, gasping for air, which I could feel moving in and out of my lungs, every ragged, desperate gulp, as if someone had turned me inside out. I remembered the breathing exercises I'd been taught to dampen the lucidity. A breath in, a breath out, slower, then slower still. It worked, my senses narrowing to a dulled pinprick of their former strength. With new confidence, I began my reading, as I should have from the start, slowly, carefully, an inch at a time. First my left fingers, hand, and wrist, then the right forearm and upper arm. The vague markings by my left elbow were gone, replaced by nothing. How strange to see blank skin in that spot. When I reached my stomach, I paused to marvel at the constellation meant to predict children. The open configuration indicated that children were a possibility, but that was it. The pattern was not specific enough to spell out the number of children or birth order, as my mother's markings had been for Miles and me, but I wasn't bothered by this uncertainty. Future children were not something I fixated on. My right hip, the place for career, I scrutinized those markings for a long time, but they also offered few details. For the lower back, I had to use the mirror, which resulted in many jumbled predictions about my future love life. An eventual marriage, perhaps preceded by 2 failed loves. Finally, I checked my sides. The skin of my right rib cage remained blank, but when I crossed over to the left side of my body, the prediction there stopped me short. It showed a diagonal, an arc, a pattern of stars. A sound like static foamed in my mind, and I almost cried out. I almost burst into tears. Mapping the future couldn't have been clearer about the arrangement of markings. 2 diagonal moles for brother, a star-like pattern for death, and an arc of 3 moles descending in size to indicate 3 years. According to the markings on my ribs, Miles had only 3 years left to live. I drifted across the room as if underwater. For a second, I pictured my brother's face, just a flash of it like a haunting. But I refused to give in to panic. I was going to dress myself, cover those markings, and from that moment on, keep them concealed, from Miles, from my family, maybe even from myself. The clothes hanging in my closet seemed unfamiliar. I ran my hand over a row of shirts and considered the cloth, the distinction between each type of fabric. Every detail now was a distraction. I pulled down a turtleneck. From the shelf, I selected a pair of corduroys, the ribbed cloth like a protective covering of tree bark against my legs. As a final touch, I wound a scarf around my neck. The knit was loose and soft, the color of blood. A time would come in the future when I'd see changeling girls wearing knee-length skirts, short sleeves, even blouses cut to reveal a sliver of midriff. Unthinkable during my days as a changeling, when we were advised to cover our bodies for our own safety. I'd want to tell those girls what it was like for me, how I relied on layers, spreads of cotton and wool I pulled harshly against my skin. These were natural fibers, breathable but heavy when wet, and it was only when I piled them on that I felt safe. As a new changeling, I dressed without imagining the lightness girls might one day experience, or how their likeliest threat of exposure was skin growing hot from the pounding force of the sun. So I think a lot about that section, and to the one I'm going to skip ahead to, which is closer to the end without giving anything away, is all about transformation. And of course, any fiction writer knows that our characters are meant to change, right? And things are meant to change and progress in some way. And I really had so much change going in this book that sometimes I had a hard time holding on to it. The change of girls and women in this world of just their bodies and on an individual level, what is going on with each of them, inside of them, and also on a much larger societal level of how everything is viewed in this world, from how women and girls are treated to gender identity to a whole lot of other things in this world. And I had to keep pushing on with the change. I heard from someone today who is partway through my book and has a prediction for what's going to happen. And I love that, predictions about a book about predictions. So I can't wait to hear how that turns out. If you were right or wrong, I'm not going to say right now. So I am going to move closer to the end and read one more section. Again, it doesn't give anything away. I try to be careful with that. But I do, one thing I want to add is, of course, this book is about bodies, and it's about gender, and it's about power and control and safety and all these things, and rape culture. But it's also on a different level about time and future and determinism and fate, and a lot of these concepts that honestly I'm not an expert in. I don't know if we have any philosophers here, but you can come up to me afterward and maybe teach me a few things. I don't know, but I did in all my research for this book, read some books about fate and determinism. Very complicated. I don't know if anyone here is an expert in learning about time, but I don't really understand time, and I think with the pandemic I understand it way less. But I tried, and it was fun to try to think it through this book. Mostly as a fiction writer, I tried to think through the psychology of my characters, and if you could really predict certain future events. Not everything in my characters' lives can be predicted. They have some mystery. But if you really could predict certain things, what would that do to you, just psychologically? How would you view the world? How fatalistic would you be? What would you think about a world like ours where you didn't know anything? So these were all questions that I really had to grapple with. And also why I guess it took me so many years to finish this book, because without doing, my first few drafts would have been very surface level, and my later drafts, I tried the best I could as a writer to go a little bit deeper. So I will wrap up the reading with one final section. On the mountain, I read a fantasy novel about a society in which markings didn't exist. No one could predict the future. The characters lived in a state of unknowing, waiting for everything to unfold before them without the benefit of fate or prediction. I read that book straight through in one sitting. How bizarre, how breathtaking to not know what would come. I placed a long-distance call that same day so I could talk to my mother about it. She could tell I was shaken. She kept saying, "It's only a book, Celeste, it's not real." But I was unsettled. In that book, both girls and boys grew up blank. They were the same. My mother at that time was working with a group of girls in another country who'd been denied education because their markings indicated they'd become homemakers. What's the point in educating them, the teachers argued, if they won't use their schooling? As a humanitarian, my mother fought for those girls. She bought them books, pencils, notebooks. She sounded out words with them. She taught them how to write, and thus gave them the whole world of literature. After we'd hung up, I spent a long time thinking of what my mother was doing, how she'd altered the future even slightly. Those girls would grow up to be homemakers, just as their markings predicted, but they'd also be changed by their ability to read. They could perhaps pick up the same novel I just finished and imagine different worlds out there, different ways to shape the same life. I tried to imagine a new world of my own making. I tried to imagine it back then after speaking to my mother, and again that night at home when I left Julia's and walked back to my neighborhood alone. I envisioned a world where girls could go out at night and where they could create their own futures. It was an outrageous dream, but I lost myself to it anyway. At home, my father was waiting for me in the living room, cloaked in shadow. "Are you ready to talk?" he asked. But I wasn't. My mother was rushing toward us on a train at that very moment. She was growing closer by the hour. I could feel her approach in my body, and I said I wanted to wait for her. "All right." He looked hurt, or maybe irritated. I suppose you always were more her daughter than mine. His words stung. I wanted to shake him, to make him see what I was really trying to say, what useless repetition ran in a loop in my head. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. But I wouldn't apologize to my father, not then and not in the future either. It might take the rest of my life, but I was going to shed the shame and guilt, wash it off my skin. Because that was what I wished for, a metamorphosis, the ability to wake up transformed. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Yeah, go ahead.
In your introduction, it mentioned that you started your own publication. Can you tell us about the process, please?
Oh, well, I started a podcast, but I was involved before that. I helped start a literary magazine. Are you interested in like starting a certain kind of publication or what? Okay. I'll just really quickly say, so I helped through an organization I'm involved with in Cleveland, Literary Cleveland. They're great. This was back in 2017. And at the time, the director at the time told me he was interested in maybe starting a literary journal, but he, didn't really have that much experience or wasn't sure. He needed an editor. And so he came to me because he knew I'd experienced a lot of it from Mar. So thank you, Mar. And so I did help him start it. And I mean, I would say my tips, the great thing about a school like this and with Mar is supported by the university because it's really hard to have enough money to fund a journal just on its own if you don't have a larger organization. So the fact that I had this organization behind me, it's not that they were flush with cash or anything, but they were the ones able to kind of support it, and I wouldn't have done it on my own otherwise. And so I did help create that. It was really fun, really rewarding. I just stepped down as editor-in-chief last year, but we had a story in the Pushcart, prize anthology and won some other prizes for it. It's an online journal, Gordon Square Review. So I was really proud of that. And then the podcast, I work at Cleveland Public Library, and this is an initiative of Ohio Center for the Book, which is at the library. So again, I don't think I would have started a podcast on my own just as an individual, but having that organization behind me and supporting me and some help with promotion is always the biggest thing for anything, unfortunately, whether it's a book or a literary journal or a podcast, is marketing and promotion. We just want to write our books or do our podcast, but that's an important thing to think about. Yeah. And then next, you have one? Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, when writing this book, process, what were the main things that you kept in mind while balancing, like, things that we see in our own things that you see and the one you created?
Yeah, I mean, I try, and again, this was my first time writing a book like this, so again, I had no idea what I was doing. I really did try to root it in being very similar to our world in terms of just the characters' emotions and what's going on in their lives. And I just tried to layer in these two competing things, the being able to foretell the future and what is happening with girls and women in this world, which can get very dark. Just spoiler alert, the book can get pretty dark at times. And even though it is different from our world, what happens to them and what the allure of these young women who are changing their predictions, it's very enticing, especially for men who don't have their own predictions, and the best they can do is try to glean predictions from other people. I mean, it's honestly just a heightened version of what I think happens in our world sometimes. And so I was taking a lot of, and talking with friends and taking a lot of the stresses of what it's like for either young girls or female identifying or presenting people who are growing through puberty or who are changing the world or who are just, no matter what's going on with them, the outside world is viewing them as sexual beings for the first time. I think that's a really powerful moment in anyone's life. And so I was just really trying to insert that emotional truth into a speculative premise. Yeah, it's kind of, I don't know, that was not easily said, but it's also easier to say than to do, I think. So I saw another hand up here. Yeah.
Just like a personal question, are you from the Cleveland area?
I'm not from there originally, but I've lived there a long time. So I was born in New York and I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So.
And how has, like, living in a pretty big city, like, how has that, like, affected? I guess, like, a lot of the not like the problems Yeah, the problems that you addressed, like,
You mean how living in a place like Cleveland is?
yeah.
Um, it's gross. Oh, Cleveland. I like Cleveland. I mean, definitely, trust me, the city has its problems, a lot of problems. So I often talk about from just the writer point of view, not the book so much, but since I'm not from Cleveland originally, I actually moved to Cleveland. I was living and working in Washington, D.C. So that's a much bigger city than Cleveland. And then, so I came to Cleveland. And so for me, from my perspective, Cleveland was a real, as a young adult at the time, I don't think I'm young anymore. At the time, I was, really struck by the low cost of living, which is great for a writer, right? It was affordable. I was able to live near the lake, and so that was good for my mental health. And there are a lot of arts organizations, and now especially with Literary Cleveland, there's a ton of writing related organizations, reading series, things like that. And there's universities there. So I felt like for a writer, it was a really great place to be. It worked for me. I had great writing groups there, etc. And then when I came here to Bowling Green, it was only a few hours away from Cleveland, so it was convenient for me. In terms of my book, I mean, there are certain things like even the neighborhood that my character lives in, and I read a little bit about it, where some parts of it are more, in a downturn. You could tell people are struggling financially, so it's not everyone is, wealthy or super privileged. But then, of course, as in many places, the privilege can be right next to the places that aren't privileged. So I think that from Cleveland probably definitely. I mean, I live in a neighborhood. I didn't base that neighborhood on mine, but I live on what I would say is the more normal side of a neighborhood, where if you go closer to a different area, it's like rich people's houses, right? So it's just like completely, it feels like two different worlds that you can walk to. And I've of course seen that in bigger cities too. Yeah, and otherwise I don't think Cleveland itself was shaping this book too much, other than by living there, I feel like it helped me have the time and space to write it. I also was able, wait, when? Yes. Okay. Before I lived in where I live now, I was in a tiny apartment. It was really hard for me to write, but now I do have the space. Like I have a little writing room and a desk. Like I have room to write. And so I know these are small things, but they can make it's a privilege to have a writing space, and it makes a big difference. Any other questions? Yeah, go here and then come back. Yeah.
Did you have any drafts that you were super like attached to and like were super disappointed you had to let go of them? And how did you cope with that if that did happen?
No. I mean, the process is really messy. So there were times I'd be revising and I would get confused or doubt myself, or like sometimes I had to undo my revisions sometimes in some places. So I wasn't always being perfect. So, but I just learned it's better to dive in with the revisions, because it's better to even undo it as long as you're getting to a better place. And so I did always feel like I was making it better because I was giving it more time and attention and taking distance from it. And I would often think, like, I'd get notes from writing group members, or I get notes from my agent, or later my editor. And I would just think, I've worked on this for so long, I can't do this anymore. I'm just not good enough of a writer. I'm just not capable of it, or I'm just done. I can't, there's nothing more I can do for this book. And I'd give it a few weeks or a few months off, come back to it. And I was like, oh, there's a lot more I can do and make it better. And then I'd get in there and make it better. And I'd be like, thank God no one has to see that old version. I mean, that was usually my end result. Like, thank God no one can read. I would not want you all to see draft 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or whatever of this book. I wouldn't want you to see that. So no, I'm very pro revision. I know people worry about over revising, and I'm not saying you can't do that, but I think it's probably more likely that writers don't revise enough than over revise. Yeah. And then you up here? Yeah.
Was there anything you found like particularly helpful in the process of like creating an imagined world?
Just trying to think of how messy my process was. It might depend on what kind of person you are. So I am very visual. So I would, in the early days, I would print out like outlines of bodies, and I would try to draw markings on them just so I could try to see it. I've drawn maps before where I'll have like the different locations or the houses of the characters, and I go through the chapters and I draw an arrow based on where the character is going on the map. And I was able to see that way that in these 5 chapters, the characters are kind of just going back and forth between their houses. And when you think about that, that's not very interesting, like narratively, it's boring. So sometimes I will try to just draw and put things out there. I printed out everything and put it on the floor in chapter chunks. I had to do that. All the little inserts in between chapters of the drawings or the book within the book section, I had to really figure out where those went. And so that would help me like printing it out and looking at it all on the floor. So I guess that was something I did a lot. Otherwise, I don't know. I just read a lot of other speculative fiction, and that helped me just think through my own book of how I can try to put it on the page. Yeah. Okay, I lost track of who else had their hand up. If anyone else has any questions? Okay, it's a cold, dark night. So thank you all so much. I appreciate it.